Story 1: The Abyssal House is a gripping horror story that delves into the haunting psychological terror of guilt, past mistakes, and the consequences of curiosity. The story begins with Ryan, a young man looking for a fresh start. His decision to move into an old mansion, isolated and perched by a silent lake, seems like the perfect escape from his troubled past. This setting is a classic horror trope, where the isolation serves as a perfect breeding ground for dread. The mansion, remote and eerie, already carries an ominous air before anything supernatural begins to unfold. The caretaker's warning about the lake adds a layer of intrigue and foreboding to the narrative. Never approach the lake after 3 a.m. is a simple, but effective piece of advice that sets the stage for the supernatural events to come. It piques the reader's curiosity while hinting at something far more sinister lurking just beneath the surface. This rule is not only a supernatural warning, but also a metaphorical one, suggesting that Ryan is about to tread on something dangerous that he doesn't fully understand. The turning point in the story occurs when Ryan, unable to resist his curiosity, ventures to the lake at night. This moment marks the shift from suspense to horror, as Ryan encounters a mysterious woman by the water. Her back is turned, and she whispers something incomprehensible, adding an air of mystique to her presence. The moment she turns around, however, the woman's face is distorted, her voice echoing with agony. This scene is incredibly unsettling because it disrupts the calmness of the lake and the night, turning Ryan's peaceful exploration into a terrifying encounter. Ryan's panic and flight back to the mansion signify the beginning of his descent into madness. What is truly terrifying in this moment is not just the vision of the woman, but the fact that the horrors don't stay at the lake. They follow him back to the mansion, suggesting that the terror is inescapable. The idea that these supernatural forces are not bound to a specific location is a chilling one, emphasizing the concept that the house itself is alive with malevolent intent. As the story progresses, the mansion begins to reveal its secrets. The walls bleed, the doors creak with the voices of the past, and Ryan feels a constant presence watching him. This escalation of supernatural events adds a sense of claustrophobia to the narrative. Ryan is trapped not just in a physical house, but in a psychological and spiritual prison. The house seems to feed off his fear, constantly increasing the intensity of the hauntings to break him down. Ryan's eventual realization that the lake and the mansion are connected to his family's dark past adds an interesting layer to the story. The supernatural events are not random. They are deeply tied to Ryan's bloodline, and this realization intensifies the horror. The haunting is not simply an external force, but a consequence of the sins and curses of his ancestors. This shift in focus from a mere ghost story to a family curse is a powerful narrative device that ties Ryan's personal history to the horrors he faces, making the story more intimate and emotionally charged. The woman haunting him is not just a spirit seeking revenge. She is a representation of the unresolved sins and curses of Ryan's ancestors. The revelation that she is waiting to exact revenge for something buried in the past shifts the story from the realm of traditional ghost stories to something far more disturbing, a reckoning with the past. The idea that our ancestors' actions can have consequences on our own lives adds a layer of fatalism to the story, where Ryan's fate seems sealed by the mistakes of those who came before him. The twist at the end of the story that the house is alive and feeding off Ryan's guilt and fear adds a final layer of horror. The house is not simply a passive backdrop for the events, it is an active participant in Ryan's torment. This revelation takes the horror to an existential level, as it suggests that the house is using Ryan's own mind against him, feeding off his innermost fears and guilt. The idea that the house itself is a malevolent entity, driving Ryan toward a fate worse than death, is a terrifying and thought-provoking twist that leaves readers with a lingering sense of dread. Overall, The Abyssal House is a powerful exploration of guilt, family secrets, and the inescapability of the past. The supernatural elements are not just about ghosts and hauntings, but about the psychological toll of facing one's past. The story's ability to combine traditional horror with psychological terror makes it a haunting and memorable tale. Story 2: The Silent House. Ellen and Mark, a young couple, are excited to start a new chapter of their lives in a grand, yet affordable house on the outskirts of town. The house, an old Victorian mansion, stands alone on a hill, surrounded by tall, windswept trees. The moment they step inside, they feel an undeniable sense of foreboding, but dismiss it as the result of their nerves. They're moving away from the chaos of the city to escape the ghosts of their past, Ellen's troubled childhood, and Mark's anxiety-ridden work life. The house feels like a fresh start, a place to heal. On the first night, everything seems perfect. The rooms are spacious, the atmosphere peaceful, and the silence welcoming. But when night falls, strange noises begin to disrupt the silence, whispers echoing through the halls, soft footsteps behind closed doors, and a faint knocking from the attic. Mark brushes it off, attributing the sounds to the settling house. Ellen, however, is uneasy. There's something about the silence that feels unnatural. It's too quiet, as if the house is holding its breath. The first real sign that something is wrong occurs when Ellen enters the attic, drawn by an inexplicable compulsion. It's empty, save for dust-covered furniture and old boxes. But as she turns to leave, she hears it, a low, guttural growl from the far corner. She quickly exits, heart racing, but doesn't tell Mark, afraid of worrying him further. She convinces herself it was nothing, a product of her overactive imagination. However, the next few nights are far worse. Strange occurrences escalate, objects are moved when no one is around. Eerie shadows move across the walls, and sometimes they both wake in the middle of the night to the sound of faint breathing next to them. Ellen becomes sleepless, haunted by disturbing dreams of a woman with hollow eyes, crying for help. The dreams are vivid and feel so real that Ellen begins to doubt her own sanity. As the weeks pass, Mark starts noticing changes in Ellen. She grows increasingly distant and paranoid, her eyes darkened with exhaustion. She refuses to go anywhere near the attic, even during the day. One evening, Mark decides to confront the situation head-on. He searches the attic, finding nothing unusual, but the air grows thick with unease. Suddenly, he feels a cold, oppressive presence behind him. When he turns, nothing is there, but the silence becomes suffocating. It's as if the house itself is watching him, waiting. The true horror reveals itself one stormy night. Mark, unable to sleep, stumbles upon an old journal hidden beneath the floorboards in the attic. It belongs to the previous owner, a woman named Margaret, who had lived in the house with her young daughter. The journal entries grow darker, describing a tragic descent into madness. Margaret writes about hearing voices, seeing shadows in the corners of her vision, and a desperate obsession with the attic. The final entry reveals a terrifying truth: Margaret believed her daughter was never truly alive, but something dark and malevolent that had taken her place. In the last line, she writes, "It is still here, waiting for someone to listen." That night, Mark confronts Ellen, who is visibly shaken. She admits that she's been hearing whispers, calling her name in the dark, urging her to come back to the attic. She tells him that she feels as though she's being pulled towards something, an invisible force drawing her to the place where Margaret's child once played. Mark insists they leave, but Ellen is determined to uncover the truth. The house, she says, is trying to tell them something. It wants them to understand. Mark, desperate, agrees to go into the attic with Ellen one last time. As they step into the dark, the air grows colder, the whispering louder. Suddenly, the shadows come to life, twisting into the shape of a small, emaciated figure. It's the child, the same one Ellen has seen in her dreams. But now, the child's face is not that of innocence, but of something older, twisted with malice. It's not asking for help. It's hungry. Before they can leave, the door slams shut behind them. The whispers turn into screams, and the attic fills with a crushing pressure. In that moment, Ellen realizes the truth. The house didn't want them to heal, it wanted them to become part of its darkness. The house was never silent. It was waiting for them to listen, to uncover its terrible past. As the storm rages outside, Mark and Ellen scream, their voices drowned by the house's hunger. The next morning, when the neighbors come to check on them, the house is quiet again. The door is wide open. But inside, there's no trace of Ellen or Mark. Just the silent house, waiting for the next unsuspecting victims to listen. Story 3: The Watcher. In the Wall, Sophie and James were thrilled when they found the perfect house, a charming, modern bungalow tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. It had everything they wanted: big windows, an open floor plan, and a spacious garden. Moving in felt like the start of a fresh chapter, away from the noise of the city and into a place that felt safe, peaceful, and private. They had big plans to make it their dream home. The first few days were perfect. The house was everything they had hoped for. But on the fourth night, Sophie noticed something strange. As she lay in bed, she heard a faint scraping sound coming from the walls. At first, she thought it was the house settling, but the sound persisted, slow, methodical, almost like something was trying to get out. She mentioned it to James the next morning, but he dismissed it, assuming it was just the old pipes. Over the next week, the noises grew louder and more distinct. They weren't coming from the pipes, they were coming from inside the walls themselves. Sophie would wake in the dead of night to the sound of scratching, followed by a soft, eerie whispering. James insisted that it was just her imagination. But Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone in the house. One evening, after hearing the sounds again, Sophie couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed a flashlight and carefully searched the house, her heart racing. As she reached the hallway, she noticed something unusual. One of the walls near the back of the house seemed slightly out of place. The paint was cracked, and the wood around it looked aged, even though the house was new. Sophie felt a strange pull to it, a sense of something pressing against her from the other side. She couldn't resist. Sophie took a hammer and began prying at the wall. The sounds grew louder, as if whatever was on the other side was aware of her attempts to break through. With one final blow, a hole appeared. Sophie shone the flashlight inside, expecting to find an old vent or a space where wires were run. Instead, she was greeted by a pair of eyes, pale, wide open and unblinking. Sophie stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. The eyes blinked once, then disappeared into the dark space within the wall. Frozen, Sophie couldn't move. Was it a trick of the light? Was it a rodent? But she could feel the presence, the oppressive weight of something alive. Frantic, Sophie ran to find James. When she returned with him, the hole was gone. The wall had sealed itself as if it had never been tampered with. James, seeing her panic, tried to calm her down. But Sophie was certain there was something in the walls. That night, the sounds came again, this time closer, almost as if the thing inside was pacing just behind the plaster. Sophie couldn't sleep. She lay awake, eyes wide open, waiting for the next scrape or whisper. But what terrified her more than the sounds was the sensation of being watched. It wasn't just the noises, it was the feeling that someone was observing her from within the walls, knowing her every movement, her every thought. The next day, Sophie discovered a series of small, old photographs tucked into the corner of the attic. They were of previous owners of the house families who looked happy in their portraits, but in the background of each photo, there was a dark, shadowy figure. A figure that always seemed to be watching them. Her fear deepened. The figure in the photos bore the same wide eyes she had seen in the wall. But it was no mere ghost, it was something much more sinister, something that had been living in the house long before they moved in. Sophie began to feel that this thing wasn't just haunting the house, it was tied to the very structure of it, lurking within the walls, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. James, growing increasingly concerned about her paranoia, called in a contractor to inspect the house. But when the contractor arrived and began removing parts of the wall, he found nothing. No spaces, no creatures, no signs of anything that could explain Sophie's fear. When he asked Sophie what she thought she'd seen, she hesitated before answering. "It's watching us. And it's waiting." That night, the tapping on the walls grew more violent. Sophie's fear reached its peak as the whispering intensified, now calling her name. She couldn't take it anymore. In a panic, she tore through the house, desperately searching for the thing that had been tormenting her. She felt it everywhere, pressing on her skin, breathing down her neck. Finally, Sophie stood in the center of the living room, realizing the truth. The house itself was alive. The thing inside the walls wasn't just haunting her, it had always been there, part of the very foundation of the house. It had been waiting for new occupants, for someone to give it life again. Sophie was just the latest victim, the next one to be absorbed into its dark, ever-watching presence. The last thing she heard before she disappeared was a whisper, soft and satisfied, "You shouldn't have opened the wall." Story 4: The echoes of Hawthorn Manor. In a quiet, secluded town, Sarah and Ethan moved into a sprawling, centuries-old manor called Hawthorn Manor. The house, with its grand design and hidden corners, seemed like the perfect place for a fresh start. The couple had just come out of a difficult period in their lives, a tragic loss, and the desire to rebuild together in a space that promised peace. But the moment they stepped inside, something felt off. It wasn't the house itself that unnerved them at first, it was the air. A stillness that wasn't peaceful, but suffocating. Sarah felt the weight of unseen eyes, and Ethan, though trying to remain optimistic, noticed the strange creaking sounds in the floors. It was nothing overt, just unsettling enough to make one feel like something was lurking just out of sight. The first night in the house, as they lay in bed, Sarah heard faint whispers. They seemed to float through the walls, barely audible. She thought it was the wind until it grew louder. The whispers took on a familiar tone, like voices she knew. Panic set in, but she dismissed it as exhaustion. When she woke the next morning, Ethan was already up, his face drawn with exhaustion. He confessed that he, too, had heard the whispers. The following day, Sarah took a walk around the property. The garden was overgrown, with wild ivy creeping up the stone walls. The house was isolated, surrounded by an almost unnatural quiet. But as she passed the old well in the far corner of the garden, something caught her eye, a reflection in the water. She leaned closer, and for a split second, she saw a figure standing behind her. Whipping around, she found nothing but empty space. A chill ran down her spine. Back inside, Ethan and Sarah explored the house further. The basement was locked, the door old and warped. Ethan tried to force it open but gave up after hours of failed attempts. Something about that door made him uneasy. But it wasn't just the basement that seemed strange. There were parts of the house that didn't seem to belong, small rooms hidden behind false walls, windows that opened into blank, brick walls, and a sense of being pulled deeper into the house with every step. One evening, after weeks of strange occurrences, footsteps in the hallway when they were alone. The cold touch of invisible hands, the house's dark history began to reveal itself. Ethan found an old journal hidden behind a loose brick in the library. It belonged to a previous resident, a woman named Evelyn Hawthorn. Her last entries were frantic, detailing voices in the walls, strange figures in the windows, and a growing obsession with a room that was never to be opened. In one of Evelyn's final entries, she wrote, "They don't leave. They are part of the house. I can hear them behind the walls, and sometimes they call my name." The words chilled Ethan to his core. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive. It fed off its inhabitants, drawing them into its grip, never letting them go. Desperate, Sarah and Ethan decided to leave the house. But the moment they attempted to pack, the walls seemed to close in on them. The air grew thick, and the whispers turned to guttural growls. The house was trying to trap them, to keep them there like it had done to Evelyn. In the dead of night, they heard the sound of something heavy scraping against the walls, getting closer. A door creaked open on its own. And then, a voice, clear and unmistakable, "You can't leave. You belong to us now." Panicked, they tried to flee, but the manor itself had other plans. The once welcoming rooms now felt like a maze, doors leading to nowhere, windows showing nothing but darkness. With every turn, the house seemed to grow larger, its walls alive with unseen eyes, its floors slick with the sweat of their fear. The last time anyone saw Sarah and Ethan was when they were found, wandering the halls in a state of madness. They had been in the house for months, though they insisted it had only been a few days. Their minds had unraveled, broken by the house's relentless torment. They spoke of Evelyn Hawthorn, of the voices that whispered their names, of the dark room in the basement that was never to be opened. When authorities arrived, the manor was empty. No sign of Sarah and Ethan, no trace of the horrors they had spoken of. The house stood still, silent as ever. But if you listen closely, you might hear the whispers, echoes of those who came before, calling out for someone to hear their story. Story 5: The House Beneath the Hill. David and Claire were a young couple looking for a quiet retreat away from the hustle and bustle of their city lives. When they came across the old cottage nestled beneath a hill, they thought their search had finally ended. The house was quaint, charming, and isolated, exactly what they needed. It had a rustic charm, with ivy-covered walls, and a secluded garden that seemed to be frozen in time. Little did they know that the house's charm was only a facade for the horrors that lay beneath it. From the moment they arrived, Claire felt something wasn't right. It wasn't overt, no loud noises, no apparitions, but there was a lingering sense of discomfort, as if the house itself was observing them. She felt eyes on her as she moved from room to room, and sometimes she would catch a glimpse of something just out of her peripheral vision, a shadow flitting past, the sound of someone moving when no one was there. David, on the other hand, shrugged it off. He was more focused on the fact that the house was peaceful, quiet, and a perfect escape. The first night in the house, Claire woke up in a cold sweat. She had a vivid dream in which a woman, her face hidden in shadow, stood in the corner of their bedroom, whispering her name. As Claire tried to scream, she couldn't make a sound. The dream was so real that Claire could still feel the chill of the air, the weight of the presence in the room. She woke up gasping for air, but when she turned to David, he was sound asleep, unaware of her distress. The next morning, as Claire recounted the dream to David, he suggested they go for a walk to shake off any lingering unease. While exploring the garden, Claire noticed something strange. There was a large stone slab near the back of the property, partially covered by overgrown grass and vines. It looked out of place, like something hidden intentionally. Driven by an inexplicable pull, Claire pushed aside the vegetation and uncovered the stone. It was heavy, but she managed to move it just enough to peek beneath. What she saw was a narrow, dark staircase leading into the earth. Her heart raced as she stood frozen in front of it. The air around her seemed to drop in temperature, and her instincts screamed at her to walk away, but her curiosity got the better of her. Claire glanced at David, who had wandered off a few yards ahead. She stepped closer to the stairway, but before she could make up her mind to explore it, a voice whispered from the shadows, "Don't go down there." Shocked, Claire spun around but saw nothing. The garden was silent. When she told David about the voice, he laughed it off, chalking it up to nerves. But Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them from below. The following days were a blur of strange occurrences. The whispers became more frequent always when they were alone. Claire started to feel like the house was alive, shifting around her, watching her every move. She began to hear footsteps behind her, but when she turned, no one was there. Then there were the cold spots, the drafts that seemed to follow her, as if the house had a mind of its own. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Claire could hear the whispers again, this time louder, clearer. They were coming from the direction of the stone slab. Her body trembled as she slowly walked toward it. This time, when she looked down into the stairwell, she saw something, an old, rotted wooden door at the bottom. It beckoned her, calling her to open it. She couldn't resist any longer. The house was pulling her in, urging her to discover what it had been hiding for so long. Without telling David, Claire descended the stairs into the darkness. As she descended deeper into the earth, the air grew thick, suffocating. The walls seemed to close in on her, the whispers growing louder, more frantic. At the bottom, Claire found the door. It was old but solid, covered in thick layers of dust and grime. She reached out, heart pounding, and opened it. Inside was a small, candlelit room, but what stood in the center sent a chill through her entire body. A figure, a woman, stood in the corner, her face pale and gaunt, eyes wide open in terror. The woman was crying, but when Claire approached, she couldn't hear the sobs. The figure's lips moved as though trying to speak, but no sound came out. It wasn't until Claire stepped closer that she saw the woman's hands chained to the wall. Suddenly, Claire understood. The woman wasn't just a ghost, she was part of the house. The house had claimed her, bound her in chains, and her suffering was tied to the very foundation of the place. It was no longer just an old cottage. It was a prison, built over centuries to trap those who dared to stay. The house had fed on her fear and her pain, and now it wanted Claire. Terrified, Claire turned to flee, but the door slammed shut. The room began to twist and contort, the walls closing in around her. As the whispers turned into shrill screams, Claire realized that there was no escape. The house was alive, and it had claimed her. Just as her vision blurred, she felt cold fingers wrap around her wrist, familiar fingers dragging her into the dark. When David finally noticed Claire's disappearance, he searched the house high and low, but found nothing. All that remained was an eerie silence. The cottage stood as it always had, quiet and peaceful. But if you listen closely, the whispers still echo, calling to anyone who dares to venture too close. Story 6: The Whispers. Behind the walls, David and Claire were ecstatic when they finally found the perfect home, Hawthorn Manor. Set on a quiet, secluded hill, the house was old but charming, with ivy crawling up its stone walls and large windows that framed the surrounding forest. It seemed to promise peace and tranquility, far from the noise of city life. But from the very first night, something felt off. It wasn't visible, nor was it loud, but an unsettling presence lingered. At first, Claire dismissed it as her imagination running wild. They had just moved in, after all, and the shift from city life to a secluded manor could understandably bring feelings of unease. But as the days passed, that unease began to grow. Claire often heard faint sounds at night, whispers carried by the wind. The sound would rise from somewhere deep within the house, only to fade away as quickly as it came. At first, she tried to convince herself that it was just the house settling. The creaks of old wood and the rustling of wind through the trees could easily explain it. But one evening, the whispers grew louder. Sitting in the living room alone, Claire thought she heard her name, soft, yet unmistakable. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. It sounded like a whisper, like someone calling out to her, just beyond her reach. She stood up quickly and scanned the room, but there was no one there. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and for a moment, the room felt colder, as though something were watching her. David, ever the skeptic, dismissed her fears. "It's nothing, just your nerves," he told her as he wrapped an arm around her. But Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, as she lay in bed, the whispers began again, this time clearer, more distinct. "Get out!" Claire's heart pounded in her chest. She turned toward David, but he was asleep, unaware of the chilling voice that had just spoken. She tried to ignore it, pulling the covers over her head, but the voice wasn't done. It came again, louder this time, more insistent. "Get out!" Her breath quickened, and she couldn't bring herself to close her eyes. The voice was coming from the walls. No, it was the walls themselves, pulsing with an eerie rhythm, as if they were alive. The next morning, Claire hesitated to tell David. He would just brush it off again, she thought. But the whispers didn't stop. Every night they grew more frequent, more desperate. Claire felt as though the house itself was alive, watching her, beckoning her to listen to the voices that crawled beneath the surface. One afternoon, while David was out exploring the garden, Claire decided to investigate. She spent hours rummaging through the attic, sifting through boxes of old belongings. And there, beneath a pile of yellowed newspapers, she found something, a dusty, leather-bound journal. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. The handwriting was faint, but legible. The journal belonged to the family that had once lived in the manor. It told the story of a tragedy, an entire family that had mysteriously disappeared without a trace, leaving only their belongings behind. The last entry was chilling. "The house is calling to us. It wants us to stay, but we must leave before it consumes us. I hear the whispers in the walls, the voices of those who have gone before us. We are trapped here, and so will the next family be." Claire felt a chill run down her spine. The whispers she had heard, the voice calling her name, weren't just the sounds of a creaky old house. They were the trapped souls of the family, the spirits of the long-gone inhabitants who had never truly left. The realization hit Claire like a ton of bricks. The house wasn't just old, it was cursed. The voices were the souls of the lost family, trapped within the walls, desperate to escape, but unable to. That night, Claire sat in the living room, trembling with fear. The whispers started again, more persistent this time. They swirled around her, seeming to come from every direction. "Help us," the voice pleaded. "Save us." Claire's breath caught in her throat. She felt a pang of sympathy, but at the same time she was terrified. What did they want from her? Was she meant to be the next victim of Hawthorn Manor? In the following days, the house seemed to grow colder, its walls tighter, as if it was closing in on Claire and David. The whispers became more frantic, more desperate. They grew louder with every passing night, pulling Claire further into a web of terror. She couldn't take it anymore. One night, she decided to confront the house, to find out what it wanted. She stood before the old fireplace, the flames flickering in the hearth. The whispers filled her ears, almost deafening, urging her to listen. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the flames in an instant. The air turned heavy, suffocating, and Claire's breath came in short gasps. The house groaned, its walls creaking like bones cracking under pressure. Then, through the darkness, a figure appeared, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through her. The figure reached out with trembling hands, its voice like a broken whisper. "Help us. Leave this place before it claims you too." Claire stumbled backward, but the figure followed her, closing the gap with each step. Desperation filled the air, the walls closing in as the whispers escalated into a maddening chorus. "Leave, or be trapped like us." Claire couldn't take it any longer. She ran, screaming for David, but the house seemed to shift, guiding her away from the exit. The whispers were deafening, pulling at her mind, urging her to stay. But Claire couldn't. She had to escape. As she ran toward the front door, the walls seemed to shake, the house groaning in protest. The door slammed shut before she could reach it. Claire screamed, pounding on the wooden door, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, echoing through her mind. David found her that night, lying unconscious in the living room, her eyes wide with terror. The house had claimed her, just as it had claimed the others before her. Years passed, but Hawthorn Manor remained, standing tall on the hill. The whispers never stopped. The souls of the trapped family still lingered within the walls, waiting for the next soul to fall victim to the house's insidious grip. Story 7. The blood-stained mirror. On their second week in Hawthorn Manor, Claire felt the house settling around her like an old, tired beast. She and David had moved in with hopes of a peaceful life, away from the noise and distractions of the city. But something about the house made her skin crawl. It was beautiful, yes, but there was something dark and hidden beneath its surface. One evening, after a particularly unsettling day, Claire noticed something new: a large, antique mirror hanging crookedly in one of the upstairs bedrooms. The room itself was unremarkable, empty save for a few pieces of old furniture. But the mirror stood out. It was beautiful in a way, its ornate frame tarnished with age. Yet, it felt wrong. Every time Claire passed it, a cold chill ran down her spine, like the mirror was watching her, waiting. Claire tried to dismiss the sensation. Perhaps it was the house settling, the weight of history pressing in on her. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly off about that mirror. One evening, when David was downstairs sorting through boxes, Claire found herself drawn to it. A reflection seemed to call to her, beckoning her closer. Standing before it, she gazed into the glass, her face lit by the soft glow of the fading evening light. But as she stared, something strange began to happen. Her reflection started to distort. The edges of her face blurred, as though the glass itself was struggling to hold her image. Suddenly, Claire's heart skipped a beat. Blood began to trickle from the corners of her reflection's mouth, but her own face remained untouched. She recoiled, her breath quickening as the blood in the mirror thickened, dripping slowly to the bottom. "What's happening?" Claire whispered to herself, her eyes locked on the horror unfolding before her. The reflection didn't move in sync with her. It didn't flinch when Claire screamed. Instead, the image of her reflection grinned a wide, unnatural grin, eyes bulging with a crazed madness. Claire's knees went weak, and she stumbled back from the mirror, her heart hammering in her chest. Her breath was shallow as the reflection remained, the twisted grin never fading. Terrified, Claire reached for the mirror's frame, her fingers trembling as she tried to pull it from the wall. But no matter how hard she tugged, it refused to move. The mirror was stuck, almost as if it had fused with the wall itself. Claire's desperation grew as she heard a faint whisper from the glass, an almost inaudible voice, speaking her name. She couldn't bear it any longer. The image of her distorted face, still grinning, was burned into her mind. The voice called again, clearer this time: "Leave before it takes you too." Shaking, Claire ran from the room, her mind racing. She couldn't stop thinking about the mirror, the blood, the face. That night, when she finally fell asleep, the terror didn't leave her. It came back. The mirror was there in her dreams, waiting. The blood-red reflection stared back at her, but this time it wasn't her face at all. The figure in the glass was a woman, her eyes hollow, sunken deep into her skull, blood dripping from every orifice. The woman's hand reached out, a skeletal hand with elongated fingers, trying to touch her. Claire woke up with a gasp, her skin slick with sweat. Her heart was pounding, and for a moment, she didn't know where she was. The room was still. The house was quiet. But she couldn't shake the image of the woman from the mirror. It felt too real. The next day, Claire ventured back into the room, determined to rid herself of the mirror. But as she entered, she froze. The mirror was no longer crooked. It was perfectly aligned, as though it had never moved. Claire's pulse quickened as she approached it, fear creeping into her bones once more. She stared at the reflection of the room, her breath hitching in her throat. There was no blood, no distorted face. But something wasn't right. The woman, the one from her dreams, was standing in the corner of the mirror, her hollow eyes fixed on Claire. Claire couldn't move. The figure in the reflection seemed to grow, its eyes never leaving hers. "Help me," it whispered, its voice cold, hollow. Claire's knees buckled, and she fell to the floor, unable to look away. Her mind raced. The mirror wasn't just a mirror. It was something else, something darker. Something that had trapped the woman's soul, keeping her in the reflection, locked away. Claire realized with growing horror that the woman was reaching out for her, desperate to pull her into the glass. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive. And it had kept the mirror as a prison for the woman who had once lived there, a prisoner of its twisted history. With trembling hands, Claire tried to pull herself up, but the reflection didn't let her go. The woman in the mirror was now inches from the glass, her fingers outstretched, her mouth opening wide in a silent scream. "Leave me," Claire cried, but the woman in the mirror only smiled. The mirror was cursed, she realized. It had absorbed the soul of the woman, trapping her in its depths. And now it wanted Claire. With a final burst of strength, Claire turned and ran from the room, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she couldn't stay, not with the mirror watching her. The house had already claimed one soul, and it was eager to take another. David found her hours later, shaking and pale. She didn't speak about what happened, how could she? But every time she passed the room, she felt the weight of the mirror's gaze upon her. The house was alive, feeding off her fear, and it had its sights set on Claire. No one ever spoke of the mirror again. But as the days passed, the whispers grew louder. And sometimes, in the dead of night, Claire would hear a soft, blood-chilling laugh, echoing from somewhere in the walls of Hawthorn Manor. Story 8. The Stairs That Lead Nowhere. David had always been drawn to the old staircase that led down into the basement. He couldn't explain why, but every time he passed it, he felt an inexplicable pull. It wasn't just the creaky wood or the dust-covered steps. There was something more, an eerie energy, a presence that seemed to linger in the air. It gnawed at him, a curiosity that he couldn't ignore, even though a part of him was terrified. The staircase itself was nothing extraordinary. It was a narrow, winding set of steps leading into the dark abyss of the basement, the kind of staircase you would expect in an old, forgotten house like Hawthorn Manor. But David couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a staircase. It was a doorway, a passage to something far worse. Claire noticed it first. One evening, as she walked past the hallway, she spotted David standing at the top of the stairs, staring down into the darkness below. His expression was blank, his eyes distant, as if he were lost in thought or perhaps something more sinister. "What are you doing?" Claire asked, her voice breaking the stillness of the house. David didn't respond immediately. He simply stood there, staring down, his body frozen. Finally, he spoke in a low, distant tone. "I don't know," he said. "I just feel like something is waiting for me down there." Claire shivered. She hadn't noticed it before, but now that he mentioned it, she couldn't help but feel that same sense of unease radiating from the stairs. But David was determined. He had to know what lay beyond the darkness, and he seemed convinced that the answers were waiting for him in the basement. The next evening, David couldn't resist any longer. He stood at the top of the stairs again, his feet rooted to the floor. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath shallow as he tried to push through the growing fear. He had to face whatever it was. He had to see it with his own eyes. With a deep breath, David finally gathered the courage to take his first step down into the basement. As soon as his foot touched the first step, the air seemed to grow colder. A sudden shiver ran down his spine, and for a moment, he hesitated, wondering if he was making a mistake. But the pull was too strong. He couldn't stop now. Then he heard it. A low, guttural growl echoed from the darkness below. David's blood ran cold, and he froze mid-step. The sound was deep and menacing, like an animal waiting to pounce. He strained his eyes, trying to see anything in the blackness, but there was nothing except the oppressive silence. Then, the growl came again, closer this time, more intense. David's heart raced as the sound grew louder, a horrible, raspy growl that seemed to vibrate through his very bones. He was paralyzed with fear, his body refusing to move. And then, through the pitch-black darkness, something appeared. A pair of glowing eyes. David's breath caught in his throat as the eyes glowed brighter, cutting through the dark like twin beacons. The rest of the figure remained hidden, but those eyes were fixed on him, unblinking, unyielding. Before he could react, the shadowy figure began to move. It crawled up the stairs toward him, slow and deliberate, each movement unnatural and jerky. David's heart pounded harder, his chest tightening with terror as the figure drew closer. His body screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to obey. It was as if the house itself was holding him in place, trapping him there. He could feel the cold breath of the creature drawing closer, the growl vibrating through his body. And then, with a surge of panic, David screamed. He turned and bolted up the stairs, but the moment his foot hit the next step, something strange happened. The stairs stretched before him, elongating, twisting, as though the house itself was playing a cruel trick. The more he ran, the further the top of the stairs seemed to get. His mind was unraveling as the house seemed to shift and stretch, trapping him in an endless loop. The shadowy figure continued to crawl up behind him, its glowing eyes never leaving his back. Desperation fueled his every move as he scrambled up the stairs, but no matter how fast he ran, the staircase never seemed to end. It felt like a nightmare, a cruel, unending descent into madness. Finally, David reached the top, his legs trembling beneath him. But when he turned to look behind him, the figure was gone. The stairs were normal again, and the growling had stopped. The house was silent, as if nothing had happened. David stumbled back, gasping for air, his mind in a haze. His skin was clammy with sweat, and his heart was still racing. He turned to Claire, who had heard the commotion and rushed to find him. She was horrified by the look on his face. David's once calm and composed demeanor had been replaced by wide eyes and a look of pure terror. "What happened?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. David opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His mind was still trapped in the horrors he had just experienced. The terror, the growls, the eyes, they all lingered in his mind, like a shadow he couldn't escape. I saw something," David whispered, his voice shaking. "I don't know what it was, but it's still down there, waiting." Claire's heart sank. She looked at the staircase with growing dread. It was just a set of old wooden stairs. But now, every creak of the wood felt ominous, every shadow a potential threat. David wasn't the same after that night. He never spoke of the basement again, and whenever he passed the stairs, he couldn't help but glance down, as if expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at him. The basement had changed him. The house had changed him. And no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that the thing in the basement was still waiting. Story 9, The Garden of Lost Souls. The garden at Hawthorn Manor had once been a place of beauty, but over the years it had fallen into disrepair. The once carefully tended flowers had been overtaken by wild weeds, and the hedges were now twisted as though the land itself had grown restless. Despite its decay, the garden still held an eerie charm, and it became a refuge for David and Claire, offering them a quiet place to escape from the unsettling history of their new home. Yet there was one spot in the garden that always seemed to draw their attention: the large oak tree that stood in the center, its gnarled branches reaching high into the sky like skeletal arms. It was imposing, and there was something about it that unsettled Claire every time she walked past it. The shadows cast by its thick leaves seemed to shift unnaturally, and the air around it always felt colder. One afternoon, as the couple wandered through the overgrown weeds, Claire's foot struck something hard beneath the tangled roots of the oak. She bent down, her fingers brushing away the dirt and leaves. To her shock, she uncovered an old gravestone, its surface cracked and weathered by time. The inscription was still visible, though faded, and it sent a chill down her spine. "Here lies the soul of Evelyn Hawthorn. May she rest in peace." Claire stood frozen, staring at the gravestone. The name Evelyn Hawthorn seemed oddly familiar, though she couldn't place where she had heard it before. Something about the gravestone felt wrong, like a presence lingering in the air, watching her. David, sensing her unease, walked over and placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's just an old grave," he said, trying to reassure her. "People have been buried here for years." But Claire couldn't shake the feeling that Evelyn wasn't just a name on a stone. There was something about the gravestone, about the land itself, that felt haunted, alive with an energy she couldn't explain. That night, as they sat by the window, the wind howled outside, causing the trees to sway and creak. Claire glanced out into the garden, her eyes drawn to the silhouette of the oak tree in the moonlight. For a moment, she thought she saw something move between the trees. Figures, shadowy and indistinct, drifting among the overgrown vines. Her breath caught in her throat as she strained her eyes, but the figures vanished before she could get a better look. She turned to David, her voice trembling. "Did you see that? In the garden?" David looked at her, confused. "What are you talking about?" "There's nothing out there." But Claire was certain she had seen something, shapes that moved with unnatural speed, fading as quickly as they had appeared. As the night wore on, the shadows seemed to deepen, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone in the garden. The next morning, when Claire went outside to check on the garden, she was startled by what she found. A fresh set of footprints had appeared in the dirt, leading from the gravestone, winding through the weeds, and stopping right at the front door of Hawthorn Manor. There were no signs of any living person having passed through the garden, no footsteps that could have belonged to David or Claire. The tracks were faint but unmistakable, as if someone or something had walked across the garden in the dead of night, leaving its mark on the earth. David, now visibly disturbed, followed the footprints to the door, his heart pounding in his chest. He bent down to inspect them more closely, but the tracks seemed to disappear the moment they reached the threshold, as though they had never existed. "Claire, this isn't normal," David muttered, his voice strained. Who or what would have walked here? It was as if the lost souls of the Hawthorn family were still bound to the land, wandering the earth without rest. The figure of Evelyn Hawthorn lingered in Claire's mind, a name that echoed through the house like a warning. Was this her doing? Was she reaching out from the grave, trying to communicate something from beyond? That night, Claire couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind seemed to carry a sense of anticipation. It was as if the very walls of Hawthorn Manor were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Suddenly, there was a sound outside, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the garden. Claire's heart raced as she tiptoed to the window, her eyes scanning the garden below. The moonlight illuminated the trees, casting long shadows across the land. For a moment, everything was still. Then, from the darkness, a figure appeared. It was a woman, dressed in a tattered white gown, her face hidden in the shadows. She moved slowly, her feet gliding over the ground, as if she were weightless, and Claire's breath caught in her throat as the figure turned toward the house. Claire backed away from the window, her heart pounding in her chest. She had seen the woman's face pale, gaunt, her eyes hollow and dark, like empty sockets staring into her soul. The woman's lips parted in a silent scream, her hands outstretched as if reaching for something or someone. It was Evelyn. The woman in the garden was Evelyn Hawthorn, trapped between the living and the dead, bound to the land by some dark force. The whispers began again that night, soft at first, like a gentle wind through the trees. But as the hours passed, the voices grew louder, more insistent. They came from the garden, from the very earth beneath their feet, calling out to Claire and David. It wasn't just Evelyn's soul that was restless. The lost souls of the Hawthorn family were reaching out, trapped in the limbo between life and death, yearning for release. In the days that followed, strange things began to happen. Claire and David would wake to find their belongings moved, the doors and windows ajar as though someone had been inside. Every time they stepped outside, they felt the eyes of the lost souls watching them, the weight of their gaze heavy on their shoulders. It became clear the garden was more than just a beautiful, overgrown space. It was a graveyard, a place where the souls of the Hawthorn family were trapped. They were bound to the land, walking among the living, seeking something that only Claire and David could provide. And as the days passed, the garden grew darker, the trees more twisted, and the whispers grew louder. The lost souls were calling, and Claire and David knew they could never escape. The garden of Hawthorn Manor had claimed them, just as it had claimed those who came before. In the end, the whispers were all that remained, echoing through the garden as the souls of the Hawthorn family walked forever among the dead. And the oak tree, now gnarled and twisted, stood as a grim reminder of the fate that awaited all who dared enter the Garden of Lost Souls. Story 10: The Hidden Room. It was late at night when David first noticed something unusual about the old bookshelf in the study. He had passed it countless times, but tonight the shelf seemed out of place. The dust on it appeared disturbed, as though someone had recently brushed against it. David felt a strange pull toward it, an inexplicable need to uncover what lay hidden behind. His fingers traced the edges of the bookshelf, searching for a secret latch or mechanism. After a moment of feeling around, he found a faint indentation on the wood. A soft click echoed through the room, and to his surprise, the bookshelf shifted, revealing a door that had been concealed for who knows how long. The air around him felt thick, as though the house was holding its breath. The door creaked open slowly, revealing only darkness beyond. David hesitated for a moment, his heart pounding. What could possibly be behind this hidden door? It was as if the house itself had been keeping a secret, one that was now being exposed after years of silence. He stepped inside, feeling a cold draft rush past him as he crossed the threshold. The room was small, cold, and stale. It hadn't been disturbed in years, decades perhaps. The walls were bare except for the faint outline of something that had once hung there. The room smelled of old wood and dust, and the air felt oppressive, like the weight of forgotten memories was pressing in. In the center of the room sat an old rocking chair, its paint chipped and worn. The chair seemed to beckon him, its presence unsettling. It rocked gently on its own, moving in a slow, rhythmic pattern. David watched it, transfixed, as if the chair itself was alive, its movements deliberate and purposeful. In the far corner of the room, a single candle flickered weakly, casting long, grotesque shadows on the walls. David's curiosity overpowered his fear, and he stepped further into the room. But as soon as his foot crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. He spun around, his heart racing, but the door was already sealed tight. Panic crept into his chest as he realized he was trapped in the room with no way out. The air seemed to grow colder, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch toward him. Suddenly, the rocking chair began to move faster, its creaks growing louder, more frantic. David's breath caught in his throat as he turned to face the corner, where a figure stood, half hidden in the darkness. The figure was a woman, her tattered clothing hanging from her frail body. Her long, matted hair obscured her face, but David could feel her eyes on him, burning through the darkness. Then, the voice came soft at first, like a whisper carried by the wind, but growing louder, more insistent with each word. "You should never have opened the door," the woman whispered, her voice crackling like dry leaves. It sent a shiver down David's spine, and he instinctively took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. Before he could react, the woman lunged at him, her hands reaching out with an unnatural speed. Her fingers were cold like ice, and as they wrapped around his throat, David gasped for air. The room seemed to close in on him, the shadows thickening, the candle flickering violently, as if struggling to stay alive. His vision blurred, and he felt as though the life was being drained from him. The woman's grip tightened, and her face, horrible and contorted, emerged from the shadows, her eyes hollow, as though the very soul had been sucked from them. David tried to scream, to fight back, but his body refused to obey. His mind began to unravel, his thoughts scattered as the darkness closed in. And just as the woman's cold hands tightened their grip on his neck, everything went black. The next morning, Claire woke to an empty house. It was too quiet, too still. Her heart skipped a beat when she noticed that David was missing. She called his name, but there was no response. She searched the house, growing more frantic by the minute. Finally, she reached the study and found the door to the hidden room ajar. The bookshelf had swung back into place, hiding the secret doorway once again. Claire stepped into the room, her pulse quickening as she scanned the dark, oppressive space. Her eyes landed on David, lying motionless on the floor. He was pale, his face frozen in an expression of pure terror. His eyes were wide open, but there was no sign of life in them. His mouth was slightly open, as though he had been gasping for breath when it had all stopped. Claire rushed to his side, shaking him, calling his name, but there was no response. His body was cold to the touch, and his skin had a strange, waxy appearance. It was as if he had been dead for hours, maybe even longer. But his face, it was contorted with fear, as though whatever he had seen in that room had left an indelible mark on him, one that no one could escape. With shaking hands, Claire tried to pull him up, but he was too heavy. His mind, his very soul, had been taken from him. The house had claimed him, just as it had claimed all those who had dared uncover its secrets. She could feel it, the weight of the house pressing down on her, the suffocating darkness that seemed to be closing in around them. She glanced toward the door, wondering if it was still locked. Was it too late to leave? But something told her that the house wouldn't let them go. It had taken David, and it would not let him or anyone escape. Claire felt a chill run down her spine as she realized the truth. The hidden room wasn't just a place, it was a prison. A prison for those who dared to uncover the house's darkest secrets. And David had paid the price for it. As she backed away from his lifeless body, the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her inside the haunted room with David's ghost. The house had claimed them both, and now they would never escape.